Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a special 5-part podcast series sponsored by Exiger on From Third-Party Risk Management to Supply Chain Risk Management. Exiger on the evolution of supplier compliance in COVID-19. First, a word about Exiger. Exiger was founded to fight financial crime, fraud, and terrorist financing by introducing technology-enabled solutions to the market's biggest supply chain, risk, investigation, litigation, and compliance challenges. Global authority on risk and compliance, Exiger services on the world's largest banks, Fortune 1000 companies, and government agencies and regulators. Exiger combines frontline expertise of former prosecutors, intel analysts, Department of Defense veterans, and compliance officers, leading technologists and forensic accountants with cutting-edge, fit-for-purpose artificial intelligence technology. In recognition of the growing volume and complexity of data and regulations, Exiger is committed to working with clients to create a more sustainable risk management environment through its holistic and innovative approach to problem solving. To find out how Exiger is making the world a safer place and more effective place to do business, visit Exiger.com or reach out to any of the experts featured in this week's podcast series. Over this 5-part podcast series, we will put a spotlight on financial institutions with Tara Loftus and Summer Pratt. We will put a spotlight on corporations with Aaron Narva and Ren McEachern. We will put a spotlight on federal government and supply chains with Carrie Wibben and Vishnu Anatamula. We'll look at the pillars of good compliance with Brandon Daniels and Carrie Wibben. And we will conclude with third-party risk management solutions with Erica Peters and Skylar Chi. In this episode, I'm joined by Brandon Daniels, President Global Markets at Exiger, and Carrie Wibben, Senior Vice President, National Security and Intelligence. We take up some of the new challenges, new solutions for third-party risk management and investigations, where things have been, and more importantly, where they're going into the future. I know you will find it fascinating. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for episode 4. Today, we're going to take up pillars of good compliance with Brandon Daniels and Carrie Wibben. Brandon and Carrie, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
So one of the themes that we have explored throughout this podcast series has been the acceleration of trends that perhaps were moving forward in literally 6 months ago, but certainly in the 20-teens, and how COVID-19 has really exponentially in many ways accelerated trends. And I was wondering, from where you all sit, what are some of the accelerated trends around financial, operational, and reputational issues relating to third parties and supply chains you both are seeing?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So just a little bit of background. I spent the last two decades in defense and intel in the federal government, and really the last 5 years I've focused heavily on counterintelligence matters and risk to our supply chains in particular. And when I spoke on the podcast on federal government supply chain risk management, I mentioned, we knew in the federal government that there were significant issues in our supply chains associated with critical acquisition programs, critical infrastructure, and those supply chains being outsourced to foreign countries. And there's been an increase in both the awareness and then the initiatives to mitigate our risk to national security that outsourcing presents. The private sector entities that comprise the defense industrial base are keenly aware of the threat posed by the weaknesses in their supply chains. So, I think the awareness has really been increasing steadily. But what we've really seen with COVID-19, with the pandemic, is that the noise has been amplified considerably. And I think most importantly, I mentioned this in the other podcast, Middle America has been awakened to the concept of supply chain vulnerabilities, with the shortage of critical medical supplies across our nation and the massive problem of foreign reliance. So it's really become a household concept. So a lot of the voices that maybe weren't being heard before are now being heard, and this has now become a personal problem for the average citizen. I think we've really seen the worst possible consequences of putting the bottom line and, lowest cost before the health and safety. of our citizens, and it's really evidenced by the complete scramble in the medical area to find safe and reliable supply chains for PPE and other medical supplies. The defense industrial base and private industry are really in the same unfortunate posture as the medical sphere. It's been underserved, it's been underfunded, but I think the signal is finally breaking through the noise.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with Carrie. I think, look, I'm an outsider to the federal government space. I mean, specifically the supply chain risk management and compliance efforts that the federal government has taken over the last 2 decades. I've largely executed risk management or consulted on behalf of clients that were trying to execute risk management practices, and have largely seen this area mature alongside of the case law that's come out, as Tara mentioned, or alongside of legislative and regulatory changes, as Tara, Summer, and Ren and Aaron all pointed out. I've seen this sort of shift in maturation of the critical areas of compliance that must exist in order to manage third-party risk evolve quite substantially over the last 2 decades in the corporate and financial space. So coming into the government over the last few years and seeing the way in which acquisition compliance had sort of had a gap in these areas of cyber, adversarial capital, and operational risk management was a surprise to me, right? And what I saw was in the COVID-19 crisis, the speed with which the federal government had to build, first of all, a tone and a consistent message around acquisition, and specifically the ability to acquire sustainable, reliable, viable goods for the use of the American citizen and the warfighter. The consistency and the loudness of that message amped up 20 times during COVID, right? You heard leaders in the various forums that are made available to connect industry and government. You heard all of the leaders saying, "Look, we need to get control of our supply chains, our third parties, the risks that we run by essentially focusing our compliance on fairness of acquisition, on lowest cost viable goods, right? Technically acceptable goods." And so you heard the first pillar of compliance sort of ring true in COVID in the federal government. And that was that there needs to be senior management commitment, right? And then after that, it was astonishing to watch the other areas sort of fall into place. And this is what I believe Carrie was saying, is you saw a dedication of resources and additional responsibility on the frontline acquisition people to take seriously, counterintelligence risk, to take seriously financial crime or financial threat risk, fraud risk. You saw people starting to think critically about how you're going to risk assess entities. I mean, Carrie, one of the things that she may or may not have mentioned in some of the past conversations was just the responsibility that she had over helping the U.S. federal government to move to a dynamic risk assessment in people. You saw that same risk assessment viewpoint that had been percolating really come to the fore in COVID, and become a critical part of how people were looking at the investments they were making and the vendors that they were engaging. You saw better communication, better training rolling out. And so what I'm seeing is the critical pillars of compliance that first I saw in financial institutions, then I saw in the corporate overhauls that you saw sort of post the Sunshine Act and the significant federal false claims cases and FCPA cases in sort of the late 90s through the mid 2000s that really brought to heel a lot of very large companies that had been conducting themselves in ways that sort of either edged on an illegal premise or was potentially outside of the law. And then to now see those pillars of compliance that were developed by those industries sort of come to life in the government in the past few months has been again, I mean, it's been record-breaking speed, but it's also been a phenomenal reflection on where we've come in terms of understanding third parties and understanding their critical risk or the component of risk that they play to our operations.
Brandon, if I could pick up on that last point, certainly under the Trump administration, we had multiple ever-changing executive orders. We've had changing in orders from OFAC around denied parties and others around trade sanctions. The Department of Justice has issued both new guidance on compliance programs and updated the resource guide we were able to visit on an earlier podcast. And regulatory requirements are changes, but changing. But one of the things that seems to me to be an accelerated factor that companies and compliance professionals have to deal with now is industry expectations. I was wondering if you would have some thoughts on how companies can keep abreast of these changes and the markets that these companies serve.
Hit the nail on the head that the pace of change, the executive orders that you've seen, as you mentioned, as you look at what the Treasury is doing around the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, the CFIUS reviews that are happening right now, as you look at what Commerce has put out in terms of an extension of some of their rules controlling artificial intelligence and how it's essentially deployed in the federal government and deployed in dual use situations, and the expansion of the ECRA to some of the emerging and foundational technologies. If you look at Department of State or DOD and things like NDAA 847, what you're seeing is the awakening that we've been talking about in the federal government start to really inform legislative and regulatory policy outward into industry. And that is going to be the beginning of a constantly iterative cycle, right? What we first saw was industry really improve and mature reputational risk policies, reputational risk due diligence, regulatory analysis, and compliance standards that met those supervisory or regulatory expectations. Now you see the major agencies across the federal government and also in the UK, right? You saw the ban of Huawei technology into their 5G rollout, right? So it's international. As you start to see this awareness of the criticality of your supply chain and the awareness of how third parties can impact your environment, start to grow in the federal government and then get responses from industry, what you're going to see is you're going to see industry go up another notch. You're going to see industry have to mature again. Industry have to be more expansive. Industry have to be more diligent than they have to date about the risks that they're incurring as they look to the providers that they use that are critical to their infrastructure. And then you're going to see the regulatory policies start to loop back, right? You're already starting to see the Department of Energy look at the EO on the bulk power system. You're already starting to see some of the international awareness of potential cybersecurity and espionage issues with relationship to critical industries like pharma and telecom, starting to change policy, procedure, and spend initiatives in those industries. And so what I think you're going to see is, industry got us to one level. This awakening in the federal government and actually international governments around the issues of counterintelligence is going to get us to a new level. And then you're going to see industry have to respond, which is going to get us to another, sort of broader, more systemic view of this supply chain risk and third-party risk beyond just the stuff that, you and I have been dealing with, Tom, like anti-bribery and anti-corruption policies, or beyond ethics, or beyond conflicts of interest. I think now it's going to be national security issues, right? National allegiance issues, dependability and defensibility of your third parties and supply chains that's going to start to ring true in industry. And that is something that industry has not contemplated in how they're governing compliance today.
Carrie, earlier in the podcast, you said something along the lines of corporations and businesses had really focused on profitability at perhaps the expense of the health and safety of their workers or other stakeholders. And I really wanted to maybe follow up with that a little bit, to ask you, can companies use compliance to not only manage these risks, but leverage these risks back to a more balanced approach to health and safety, and perhaps even to stand out as a market differentiator?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think we're really just starting to see this trend emerge. And I see it, again, having intimate familiarity with how the federal government has done acquisition since probably the beginning of time, where it just focuses on the three pillars, right? Cost, schedule, and performance. So the challenge really that we were faced with, and I say we, wearing my government hat not too long ago, but DoD in particular, is how to bake in security into those pillars and really create the right set of incentives, carrots and sticks, to drive the behavior, this sort of evolution to much more of a national security mindset within these companies. And the defense industrial base is estimated to be about 300,000 companies, so it's quite large. But what we're seeing now, again, accelerated significantly by COVID-19, is that DoD is really more aggressively than I've ever seen in the past, baking security in as the foundation of those pillars. And they're doing that in a number of ways, and they're doing it through, legislation. There's a lot of draft legislation coming out in the National Defense Authorization Act. There's already been a really increased steady drumbeat and trend line there to strengthen the law and the legislative requirements every year for supply chain, for cybersecurity, federal regulation, and defense. They call it DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, are being drafted and promulgated. And then lastly, it's, these requirements are making their way into contract language. So the last thing, that DoD needed to do really is say that security is an allowable cost in the acquisition process. And I've now heard them say that consistently over the past year, that is absolutely an allowable cost. That incentivizes industry, these 300,000 companies that do business with the federal government, to actually be willing to make that investment in security hygiene and cybersecurity, cyber sensors, and in insider threat programs within their companies. And then certainly investing in supply chain illumination and tools to understand and conduct diligence within their own supply chains. Those requirements, as they continue to mature, I think DoD will tie them to performance. So as they look to award a contract, DoD, federal government, they always look at past performance And I think they're going to start looking at your security performance as a measure of your past performance. And that's really the easiest way to bake it into the 3 existing pillars. So that's what I see happening. And again, I think as I mentioned on the other podcast, I think the companies that take that seriously, the companies that make that early investment now and don't wait for maybe every contract to be retroactively updated with the language that mandates it, they will be considerably advantaged going forward, and much better position to win future work with the DoD and the broader federal government.
Brennan and Carrie, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I was wondering if listeners wanted more information on any of the topics we've discussed, where can they go?
Yeah, so I mean, my favorite places, and Carrie, you let me know what you think as well. I mean, obviously, with regard to the recent executive orders, I mean, there's a good amount of publication that's just in the Federal Register, in some of the industry associations like INSA. DoD is supporting an industrial-based council that is providing a lot of information to the industry, and obviously NDIA is another great place. We've also had an opportunity to opine on some of these changes and to give people practical guidance on how to solve some of the challenges that these changes will essentially necessitate. And so if you go to the Exiger Federal Solutions page, that's one great resource. Also, Exiger's perspectives on the website. And then, Carrie, any others that I'm forgetting?
I think there's a few other links, Tom, that we'll just include in the notes section of the podcast. I think would be good references for folks if they want to learn more.
Well, Carrie and Brendan, thank you so much. I hope our listeners will join us for our 5th and final podcast in this podcast series where we take a look at solutions in third-party risk management. Thanks again. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this special podcast episode sponsored by Exiger, where we're taking a look at third-party risk management and supply chain risk management. Check out Exiger at their website, www.exiger.com. We list a lot of resources in the show notes from these two speakers, so check those out if you want any more information. I hope you'll join us again for our next episode in this special 5-part podcast series, from third-party risk management to supply chain risk management. Exiger on the evolution in supply chain compliance during COVID-19. This has been a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.